thought we always want to divide things into two. You know, there are two kinds of people in the world. So let's say that there are two kinds of religious experience, or religiously or spiritually minded people could be identified as having two main interests, put it like that. The first struck me very powerfully when I think I was in Taiwan. I went into a Chinese temple packed with people, a real factory of prayer and religion, and lines of people queuing up for a few moments with a priest or a temple guardian. I'm not quite sure what they were called. And we were just watching this. I suppose we might find the same thing at a Christian pilgrimage site as well. And I said to the person who was with me, what are they asking or speaking about with these priests? And he said, well, he just sort of shrugged his shoulders and he said, well, same as everything. Health and long life, prosperity and fertility. And I thought that's probably it, really. That's what religion is for. It gives us, many people, perhaps all of us to some level, a reassurance that these natural, simple, basic human aspirations are, you know, available or can be achieved in some way with the help of God or the gods. So these are, or the ancestors. So these are universal human concerns. I mean, they drive probably government policies still. This is what people want. This is what people aspire to. Health, long life, prosperity, and maybe less in the Western world where the fertility rate is going down, or birth rate is going down, but fertility. So these are universal concerns. And to a greater or lesser extent, we can see these as a gift from God. And we all do this. Somebody said to me the other day, well, it was about somebody whose brother-in-law who's having cancer treatment, and they found a good doctor, they found good treatment. They've accepted that it's not, you know, going to cure, but it can relieve and extend life. And this person said, God was good. Well, you'd have to, yes, so God was good, enabling them to find this person. They didn't say he got cancer because he had been a bad person. So this is not always totally logical, and sometimes we use these phrases or use this way of thinking and talking to express something that we can't express, like in other ways. To express joy, or to express happiness, to express a sense that we are dependent upon forces outside our control. So, you don't want to be nitpicking about this, and or somebody says to you, you know, will you pray for me? You don't say, no, I don't believe in petitionary prayer, but I'll think about you, or something like that. So, this isn't about, this is not a legal thing, or even, in a sense, a totally intellectual thing. So, we can see these good things of life as gifts from God, or benefits that we can win from God, or the gods, if we obey and worship them. Well, that's another complication. That if you don't have these benefits, and you want them, there are ways and means that religion offers, tried and tested, presumably, in your tradition, to to make it more likely that God will provide them. In the Old Testament, misfortune in society, or certainly before misfortune in society, plagues, famines, wars, are often seen as coming directly from infidelity. The people were unfaithful to God, or you were unfaithful to God, or King David was unfaithful to the divine precepts and therefore suffered, and the people are going to suffer as well. There's a direct connection. And therefore, God becomes hurt and angry. It's very anthropomorphic, God. We hurt God's feelings, or we outrage God in some way. And he becomes angry and sends these misfortunes, or threatens to send them. But God changes his mind. God can relent. God can be persuaded to do something else. So what is this a model of? I think it's something we all recognize. It's our parents, isn't it? Or our teachers at school. This is when you're very young. There's not much of a difference between the word God and your parents or authority figures of that kind. It's deep. So this attitude to religious experience, this way of explaining life, this way of finding meaning, is deeply embedded, I think, not just in our theology. There's not a lot of theology in this, but deeply embedded in our psyche, our psychological imagination, because we see God as parent. Father is or mother. And as children, this is how our mothers and fathers had to deal with us. They had to train us, correct us, punish us, and reward us. And we would see our parents change their mood a lot. When we won our parents' approval again, we felt happy and peaceful and joyful again. These changes of mood, depending upon how you were brought up, could be quite dramatic. So there's that, I think, that isn't carefully thought out, or it's not a chosen way of belief, but it is a deeply embedded response to the light and shade, the good and bad things of life, and a way of also explaining them, because we like to be able to explain things. It's not easy for us to live in a state of uncertainty. The recent research that, on the way the two hemispheres of the brain operate by Ian McGilchrist, or summarized, I think, very brilliantly by Ian McGilchrist, describes the left hemisphere of the brain, which is the dominant way of thinking in our culture, as creating models of reality. So we've already done that now. I don't get lost every time I get from my room to here. So I know the way. So I've got that little model somewhere in my neurons, I don't know. And so we create this model of reality, and then of course we stick to it. And we then defend it. And we can become over-invested in that model of reality because it's our ideology, because it's our policy, it's what I'm making my money out of or reputation out of. Happens in the academic life as well as in politics and science. Scientists often resist changes in paradigms, new ideas. So, and also, he says that this is not just an opinion, but he says, based on research, whatever that means, people who have over-invested in this left brain mentality, way of seeing, way of attention, find it very difficult to say sorry. You know, they will find any way they can of avoiding saying, I made a mistake, let's move on. So the right hemisphere of the brain, which is, you know, the Martha Mary story, so Mary is probably the right hemisphere of the brain, the more contemplative one, and although that is looked down upon by the left brain mentality, it's all a bit flaky. You know, the right brain people are those who meditate, who write poetry or, you know, nice activities, but it doesn't make the world go round. It's like some years ago, the cardinal in charge of the Vatican Bank famously said, well, you know, the church doesn't run on Hail Marys, you know. So that you can look down upon dismiss or patronize the right brain activity. And the right brain activity, however, according to this new understanding, is actually directly in touch with the data of experience. It's actually the first point of contact with reality. So, and it then neurologically sends this data to the left hemisphere, which creates the model of reality that is useful, and then this right hemisphere can use it as well. And of course the two hemispheres are meant to work together very closely, and if you've had a stroke on one hemisphere, I forget all the details now, there are certain features which the other hemisphere can take on for you. So, the right hemisphere of the brain is therefore, not surprisingly, much more able to live comfortably in a state of uncertainty. It can be open-minded because it's constantly receiving new data, new information. Life can be wonderful because it is always renewing itself. And you don't know what's going to happen, but you're okay with not knowing. The way of unknowing is the contemplative way. The little book, The Cloud of Unknowing, describes that. So it's not ignorance, it's just another way of knowing. Compared with the left brain mentality, it is ignorance. Because it's not just piling up data and creating models that we work with. It's about being in the flow rather than creating fixed models. So, and this, I think, pans out when we look at the results or the effects, the influence of meditation, of regular meditation in our life. One of the things that many people meditate for, without any spiritual or religious meaning, is to reduce their stress, tension, and anxiety, which arise, of course, very strongly when you feel that you have to be in complete control of everything and that you are competing for your life. Of course you're going to feel stress and tension at work and everywhere else in your life. Everything is going to be a battle. Everything is going to, you're on the defensive or the attack all the time. So, but when they learn to meditate, one of the first things that happens is the research shows that these hormones that create stress reduce. And the amygdala, that part of the brain which deals with flight and fight and, you know, can make you very aggressive, the activity in that part of the brain reduces dramatically. And the prefrontal cortex shows, it lights up. And that's the more open, rational, calmer, let's deal with this in a sensible way, let's not panic about it, executive function. So, and Ian McGilchrist he doesn't talk about meditation at all. When he came to speak at our centre in London, somebody, of course, asked him, and I suppose imagining that he would give the right answer. He said, and how does meditation affect this rebalancing of our consciousness? And he said, I don't know. He said, I've never meditated, and I've never studied it. But he said it would make sense to me that it could. So anyway, so let's come back to this way in which we make meaning of experience, and especially through our religious models of God, of reality. So this idea, a very common religious idea that God punishes the bad and rewards the good, is deeply embedded in us, I think, because of our psychological rather than our theological training, although it becomes reinforced by theology. And it becomes associated, for example, with the prosperity gospel, which is a very perverse form of Christianity, which is based upon the idea, of sort of thin theology, that God wants us to be happy, prosperous, rich, healthy, have everything, all the good things in the world. But we have to do something, and usually that means pay something, in order to allow God to give us these good things. And if we don't get them, then it's a sign of God's disfavor because we've done something wrong. Who was the TV evangelist in the States who on 9/11, I think on the night of 9/11, said that this was God's punishment on New York City because of homosexuals and abortion clinics in New York. He withdrew his accusation, I suppose, after he found his donations were being reduced. So, this is an attitude that offers an easy, ready-made explanation for things, but it doesn't stand up to a lot of examination. How can, after all, God be all-loving and at the same time punish us and often punish the innocent? Doesn't really make sense. And this is still a very common question and anxiety and religious problem for a lot of people today. It's still the paradox or the contradiction that they struggle with when it comes to faith of any kind. So this idea of religious experience doesn't really satisfy our need for meaning. It gives a sort of a Band-Aid solution, but like Band-Aid solutions, the problem keeps coming back. And because of that insufficiency of this model of God, of meaning, of religious experience, we are innately ready for another model, because the other one simply isn't delivering. We are ready for another model of experience if we can find it, if we can find someone to teach it to us. Now, there is a bridge between this, if you might say, contractual model of our relationship to God. God will love us provided that and give us this on the condition that, or this angry God model, and the other one, which we could call the contemplative model or the mystical model. It's the contemplative model, really, because it's easier to think of ourselves as contemplatives than as mystics. In this contemplative way into religious experience, we find the teaching of Jesus. This happens to be the way Jesus taught. In his teaching on prayer, he says things like, Do not go babbling on like the pagans who think that the more they say, the more likely that it is that God will hear them, because God knows your needs before you ask. Well, that's pretty clear. He's not saying you can't make your needs known in petitions and intercessions, but you don't need to, and you have to be careful that you don't fill up all of your prayer time with that kind of anxious intercession or petition. Or he says, when you pray, go into your inner room. The Greek word for that is temeon. And the inner room, as he describes in that passage, go into your inner room, close the door, and pray to your Father who is in that secret place, that mysterious place. And then he says, and your Father who is in that secret place will reward you. So we'll come back to that idea. So Jesus does use, at times, the idea of reward, but very differently from the sort of prosperity gospel or that other psychologically dominated model of God. Very differently. It's a metaphor. I said yesterday that we can only say anything about God by using ordinary human language. Like God is good, or reward. But it should mean something very different when we apply it to God than when we apply it to ordinary day-to-day life and socio-economic or hierarchical relationships. And he tells us, of course, too, to have a calm mind. Do not worry when you come to prayer. Lay aside your worries. Concentrate. Set your mind on God's kingdom before everything else. Be single-pointed. So when you put his teachings on prayer in the Sermon on the Mount together, there's a very clear teaching on contemplation, if you like, and the question then is, how do we do it? He doesn't give us a method of meditation. He didn't go around giving talks or retreats on Christian meditation. But that question, how can I put this into practice, was asked by the early Christians. And it's quite probable that he taught his disciples how to pray if they asked him. He gave them the Lord's Prayer, which is a repetitive prayer. I'm not saying that that's the only way, but that in the traditional contemplative transmission, the actual teaching of a method of how to do it was often just personal. It often wasn't written down. It's not that it was perhaps, I don't know, that it was kept a secret. The cloud of unknowing suggests that it could get you into trouble in the Middle Ages. And so he says, don't pass this book around to too many people. But also perhaps because they felt that it was best communicated one-to-one or in small groups or in a small community. I mean, John of the Cross, Teresa of Avila don't really give methods of prayer. So we're in a different world where we can see on a mass scale the delivery, the transmission of actual methodologies of contemplative prayer. Maybe we could also say that, well, there are many other reasons we might find for that, that in less stressful, anxious times, people had time to discover this for themselves, or their forms of devotional prayer would naturally lead them into these methods of meditation. And maybe many reasons, but certainly it was not common it's not common to find descriptions of how to put the teaching of Jesus into practice. Until, of course, you get to the Desert Fathers. That was in the 5th century. That was written down. John Cassian describes in the 10th Conference very clearly how to meditate, how to say the mantra, and that's what John Main picked up. But on the whole, it's less obvious. And then you have the way of the pilgrim in the 19th century, a very specific method, the same method actually, of the prayer of the heart that the pilgrim discovers, practices, teaches, and describes. So, in the contemplative way into religious experience, or the contemplative meaning of religious experience, we find the teaching of Jesus. Misfortune and suffering are not seen as a punishment by God, but they are either the result of our own actions, something the way you can also interpret the Old Testament texts. You have brought this misfortune on yourself by the way you have acted, by being unjust, by being corrupt, by perverting the real meaning of religion. The prophets would say, you have brought about a social disaster. So we could say that it's at a personal level, it's the result of karma. Or, not everything is karma, in a realistic way, because there are accidents, there's bad luck, they're your genes, and they're just natural forces. So if Jesus speaks about God rewarding us, it is an analogy of a parental relationship. But it's not meant to be taken literally, and he clearly shows this when he says, in another passage, your heavenly Father is like the sun who shines on good and bad alike, and is kind to the ungrateful and the wicked. And in many of the parables, the shepherd goes after the one lost sheep, the woman finds the one lost coin, and the great parable of the prodigal son. So the model of God here, of religious experience here, is one of totally liberated now from this model of reward and punishment. When the father receives the prodigal son back, he doesn't even blame him. He doesn't say, where have you been? What have you been doing? How much did you run up on your credit card? He's just overwhelmed by the joy of finding his son again. So the reward that we find when we enter the temeon, the inner room, or the storehouse, as it's translated in another passage, we find a reward there. It's the reward of joy and of peace. Not necessarily of prosperity, long life, health and fertility. But we find God, the Father, the ground of being. And this is inbuilt, it's not mechanical, and it's not just neurons either, because we experience it as grace, as gift. This is the part of the mystery of it, and part of what makes us wonder about it. We have to do the work, we have to prepare ourselves, we have to go into the inner room, we have to close the door and stay there for a certain amount of time. On the other hand, it's not just the result of a technique, ultimately. If you do approach it as a technique in order to get certain benefits, there's no doubt you will get certain benefits. At least the medical research suggests that. and it seems true. However, the meaning that you attribute to these benefits will need to be revisited or renewed, because once the experience has begun to dawn, the experience of peace, you may interpret it first of all, oh, I'm less stressed. Well, why are you less stressed? It's another way of saying you're beginning to find peace. And the more peace you find, the more you're going to experience or sense that this is not just the mechanical result of a technique that you've performed, but in some way it's gracious, it's a gift. Perhaps in the sense that you discover that it was pre-existing, it was there already. So you're finding it, you're not making it. And that sense of finding something that is already there, as it were, waiting for you, that awakens in us even a sense of gratitude. It's like when you lost your car keys and you find them, and you desperately needed to find them quickly, and you find them, you can't help but feel gratitude. I lost a notebook the other day, and we searched high and low at Bonneau for it. We could not find it. And I had given up. And then I got an email to say that the architect had taken it away with him by mistake. I felt tremendously grateful. So it's just inevitable that we feel thankful when we find something that we have lost or something that we were looking for. Even if we didn't know we were looking for it, then we find it because it was already there. This feeling of gratitude is related to grace, and so that's going to make us say, what does this really mean? This isn't just neurons or biology. What else is it? So prayer is, in a sense, about preparing us to be ready for the gift. It's not a technique to manipulate God to fulfill our wishes. That's a clear understanding in this contemplative tradition. And this allows us to make meaning in a much broader and richer way. For example, Simone Weil, who was definitely on this mystical side, Simone Weil, although loved the church and loved religion as well, loved the forms of religion, or had problems with the church, but loved. But she was essentially, of course, a mystic. And one of her great insights was, about suffering and joy. She doesn't see them as reward and punishment. She says, if you are waiting for a letter from someone you love, and the messenger comes with the letter, you don't look at the messenger and say, what an ugly messenger. You just are grateful for the message that brings you the affirmation of love. So this love of God, this reminder of our being in the love of God, can come to us through suffering, the ugly messenger, as well as through joy, through the handsome messenger. So that's a demanding interpretation. It demands a lot of us. It challenges us, but it also takes us forward. John Main speaks about two kinds of presence in meditation. He says at times you will feel the presence of God emotionally and well-being, peaceful, joyful. At other times, it will seem that that is not present. And that absence of God, however, is another form of presence. That's also very challenging, but it's a good challenge because it would help us to persevere in the practice of meditation. In other words, you don't give up because you're going through a period of dryness or of feeling, you know, the batteries run out. So this mystical contemplative meaning of religious experience is not abstract or elitist. It's actually very accessible, and it is at hand for anyone, for those simple enough and poor enough in spirit to find it. And that is the message of the gospel. The kingdom of heaven is close at hand. Jesus, on one occasion, this is from chapter Luke, at that moment, Jesus exulted in the Holy Spirit. It's almost like those stories about Ramakrishna suddenly having a moment of ecstasy. So he exulted in the Holy Spirit, and he said, I thank you, Father, Lord of heaven and earth, for hiding these things from the learned and the wise and revealing them to the simple. Yes, Father, such was your choice. That's the way it is. And that revelation of that the mystery, the ultimate mystery of God is better known to the simple, is immediately followed by one of the highest theologies of the gospel. Everything is entrusted to me by my Father. No one knows who the Son is except the Father, or who the Father is but the Son, and those to whom the Son chooses to reveal him. So it's as if this simplicity actually is the key into the deepest mystery. However, that mystery may be expressed. Now, what's important, I think, is in our model of the church, is to see that these two kinds of meaning, say the parental God who's going to reward and punish, on the one hand, and the God that Jesus, the Father that Jesus speaks about, that these two kinds of meaning may be related to the same kind of experience, or similar experience. In other words, devotional experience through prayer that uses very powerful emotional images of God or rituals can open a deep experience of contemplation. Not that there is an economy class and a business class and a first class. You get the same kind of service in each. It's one class and the same kind of service. And on the other hand, someone whose meditation has led them through silence and stillness and the discipline of the mantra to a deep experience of the love and peace of God within them, may also feel drawn freely to devotional expression. And for many, I think, the Mass can mean much more, and other forms of prayer. And you're free. You're free to pray in whatever way you like. And that's why this is what has to be taught in the church. It's not that there are two types of people, or and two separated kinds of experience. These two kinds of meaning, or two approaches, are not necessarily opposed. I mean, they can be opposed. You could have an elitist kind of meditator who looks down on devotional practitioners, or you could have very traditionalist devotional practitioners who think that anything contemplative or meditation is not Christian. So they can be opposed. But the work, we would hope, of the teaching function of the church is to show they're not opposed. But we've got to have the teachers to do that. These two kinds of meaning are not opposed, but if they are to be seen as complementary, then they must both be present on the table. They must both be available. And again, coming back to what we do with children, children can be taught to meditate. We know that. But they can also be taught to pray and to worship in other ways. And for them, there's no opposition or contradiction. So what matters is not so much the theological working out of all of this, but what really matters is who teaches you. Who teaches you? This is something you find more over and over again in the Upanishads. You have to find a teacher. Now they're talking more about enlightened gurus, but also the word guru can mean parent in the way it's used, or teachers at school. So we need to find the teachers who we can pray with and who can teach us or to reteach us how to pray. So we need to, I think, recover this contemplative dimension in the same way as we need culturally, institutionally, this is what we'll be talking about at the seminar, to recover, to rebalance the left and the right hemispheres of the brain in our organizational structures and operations. And if not, we are going to experience these as in conflict. It's going to be like we're going to be constantly grating against each other, and sparks will fly. Religious people usually are very argumentative. We've had wars of religion, and we could have them again. 1/4 of the Christians in the world are in Africa. And 1 in 12 people on the planet has a Pentecostal form of Christian faith. By 2050, there will be an equal number of Muslims and Christians. These are two of the religions on the planet which have a tendency towards conflict, rejection, fundamentalism. This is very dangerous. We had, I won't go into the details, but a few years ago we had a conflict within one of our communities, national communities. And I was astonished by seeing and these were even, well, we were never quite sure. Well, we dealt with it by saying we weren't sure whether they were really meditating or not. But I was astonished by the intensity of the anger. More on one side than the other, I must say, but nevertheless. And I think in the Vatican politics at the moment, the intensity of anger, hatred against the Pope from those who disagree with him is very difficult to understand. It reminds me of the time I was with some very lovely group of people in Connecticut years ago when Clinton was in power, and I said something approving of Clinton, and suddenly these lovely, nice, civilized, sweet people became just like raging bulldogs, you know. Hatred. I've never seen such hatred of a politician. Politicians I like and don't like, but that level of hatred. So, this can get into religion as well. The contemplative hemisphere of faith has to be strengthened in religion, if only to avoid new wars of religion. Perhaps we need to think of religion, or religious experience, not so much in terms of what you believe or don't believe, but more in terms of holiness. Not in terms of progressive or conservative, but in terms of holiness, which is perhaps the common meaning of all religious experience. The Dalai Lama says, my religion is kindness, and if a religion doesn't make you a nicer person, it's not working. It's a simple but true statement. So we could say, does our religious experience advance us on the way of holiness? So that at least maybe gets the discussion into another space. And a very good way of pursuing that is Pope Francis's recent exhortation to holiness that he published, a call to holiness. And he wrote it not to define holiness in a textbook sort of way, but to remind people of the call to holiness. It's an interesting point. We are to remind us that we are called to holiness, not to success, not to many other things, but to holiness. And then he describes holiness. It's ordinary.
Which one are you referring to? Not Laudate, the one?
No, exhortation to holiness. What is it?
In Latin.
Exultate et gaudate. Gaudate et exultate, yeah.
That's the recent.
What? Well, yeah, I think it's the most recent.
Rejoice and be glad.
Yes.
You are referring to
Yes.
that?
Yes. That's the one on holiness, yes? Yes, okay. So he says holiness is not about perfection. Holiness presents the most attractive face of the church to the world. Holiness is not about imitation so much as about being the unique person God calls you to be. It's not about, we don't become holy by becoming self-obsessed about our sinfulness. Holiness is expressed in small gestures. And although he gives many examples of holiness in daily life, in domestic life and family life, and he also emphasizes the need for silence and stillness. He says we simply cannot do without the silence of prolonged prayer. The enemies of holiness are Gnosticism, and by that he means a disembodied intellectualism, so where religious truth just becomes entirely theologically abstract and ideological, and Pelagianism, which is another word for self-sufficiency. In other words, if I fast and deny myself pleasures and I train myself and I obey all the rules, I keep fit spiritually, then I'm okay. So it's legalism. He has a wonderful expression, the army of the forgiven. That holiness makes us realize that the force or the power of the church, for example, is, or religious people, is not about threatening or using naked force or violence or blackmail. It's about being this army of people who have discovered what it is to be forgiven. And of course, holy people, he says many of the saints we've canonized, if you look at some of the things they said, they were wrong. They weren't perfect. And the holy person should be angry about conspicuous spending, about injustice, about fake politics. There should be a healthy prophetic anger in the holy. It's not a removal from ordinary life. And he says the Russian pilgrim did not find that the prayer of the heart separated him from the world. And that's why we're having this seminar. So holiness is not only moral, but it's also ontological. It's about how we are and discovering new depths, new aspects, new ways of knowing ourselves. And the deeper we go into the self, into ourself, the more we discover the universal truth of non-duality, of unity. Not two, one undivided without a second. The opposition of me and you that causes a lot of conflict and complications at the more superficial levels of self-knowledge and consciousness and day-to-day life, rubbing up against other people and competing and for limited resources and space. That reduces that conflict, that sense of an opposition between me and you, just simply reduces the deeper we go into the self. It'd be very difficult to be a regular meditator and to be a racist, for example. I think it would be very difficult to be a regular meditator and be running a scam, you know, telephone scam, or, you know, exploiting, getting money out of old people at home and that sort of thing. So this experience of non-duality or of unity, simplicity is another word for it, is at the heart of the gospel as well. The Father is greater than I, Jesus says, but in the same breath, the Father and I are one. So it's only the right hemisphere of the brain, the contemplative mind, that can deal with that kind of paradox or apparent uncertainty. The common truth, this is a common truth in all religious traditions. It's at the core of them all. It's a wisdom that radiates from an experience beyond words, beyond concepts, but which of course finds expression in words and concepts, and eventually even in structures and rituals. But the core is always there, and it's the common core. And it's what enables us to share ourselves religiously with people of other faiths. The idea that religion was, you know, could be made redundant by science and technology is, no one believes that, I don't think, anymore. So it's very vital that we do what we can to make sure that the religion or the religions of the world are connected through this common truth that they share. They're not the same, but they do have this common core, common truth, experientially. We would express that by saying, there is one God. Basic affirmation of the Bible, there is one God. And we are much closer than we are separate from each other. So let's end, as we began, with this, with a reading about the self in the from the Upanishad. Basic truth, perhaps, of the Upanishads is that the Atman, which refers to the individual, deepest core of the individual self, is one with, identical with, Brahman, God. It's not the same, but it's very similar to the idea, the biblical idea, that every human being is an image of God, is created in the image of God. So two little passages from them. One I read yesterday. As long as there is separateness, one sees another as separate from oneself, hears another as separate from oneself, smells another as separate from oneself, speaks to another as separate from oneself, thinks of another as separate from oneself, knows another as separate from oneself. But when the self is realized as the indivisible unity of life, who can be seen by whom can be heard by who can be smelled by who can be spoken to by who can be thought of by who can be known by whom. My beloved, how can the knower ever be known? And this is from a later passage. The self, pure awareness, shines as the light within the heart, surrounded by the senses. And there's a 2nd century homily written for Holy Saturday, which I didn't bring with me, I'm afraid, where Jesus, the risen Jesus, is speaking to us. And there's I'll bring it later, maybe, or read it at Mass. There's a memorable passage where he in his risen glory, is speaking directly to us, to his disciples. And he goes through a number of ways of describing what's happened to him and where he's been. And then he ends by saying, "You and I are one undivided person," which is pure non-duality. You and I are one undivided person.